Is it painful? Is it hard? Is it difficult? Does it require vulnerability? Does it require like the fact that we might be, rejected or whatever? Like, yes, all of that is true. All of that is very true. But it also does mean like that we can totally do this.
Hi, everybody. It's Linda Lorelle. Welcome to another episode of Our Voices Matter podcast. My guest today is Shannon Foley Martinez, a former neo-Nazi white supremacist who left the movement more than 25 years ago and now is working to help others who want to come out of the movement. I first interviewed Shannon in the fall of 2019 as part of a video project that I was producing about countering violent extremism. We had an extraordinary, wide-ranging, hour-long conversation that I urge you to go back and watch or listen to. She goes into great detail in that conversation about her history and her background, the environment that she grew up in, and the trauma that she experienced that led directly to her seeking out and becoming involved in the white supremacist movement. She's got 8 kids of her own now. She's been out of the movement, as I said, for over 25 years. And her voice is one that is being sought at this moment in time because of what we are going through in the aftermath of the January 6th attack on the Capitol and everything that's really happened over the last couple of years. So I hope that you will get something out of this conversation with Shannon, especially if you are a white person who has loved ones or friends in the white supremacist movement, in the QAnon movement. Shannon talks in great detail about some tools and some language and things that you might be able to do to try and help reach them. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Shannon Foley Martinez. Shannon, it is so great to see you again. Gosh, it feels like forever since we talked. It's only been a year and a half.
Really?
Yeah, it was October. It was the fall of 2019. It was the fall of 2019.
Wow.
And the world has changed quite a bit since then, and blown up even more than it had already begun to blow up when we talked back then.
Wow.
So I was really excited to talk to you again. I have to say that our first interview is one of the most watched, most listened to podcasts that I've done in my 2 years of doing this. And I think it's because people are so hungry for an answer to hate. How do we combat it? And your story, having come from the background that you did and the life that you're living now, is resonating on such a big level. So let me stop talking for a moment and ask you to kind of fill me in on what you're thinking and feeling at this moment in the wake of January 6th.
Well, the wake of January 6th is also the wake of, the last 5 years, which is the wake of, the last 300, 400 years, or whatever.
It's all connected.
I'm hundreds and hundreds of emails behind, people just reaching out, concerned about their family members. A lot more people reaching out about their family than people reaching out who are trying to leave. There's some big leaks about to drop from some internet spaces where a lot of white supremacists and neo-Nazis and stuff had all congregated. And so I've had a handful of people very recently start reaching out about that people who have left, and they're just like, but all my information is on this forum that's about to be leaked. So I'm very busy way.
So what you're saying is that there are people who have been engaging in these white supremacist forums, and that information from these forums is about to be leaked.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Okay. It will be a very big deal.
Well, what are they expecting? I mean, tell me, what is this going to look like?
I mean, a lot of the leak, so it's this thing called Fascist Forge. That's a big sort of like bulletin board style, like forum. And it'll have, data, it'll have location data, it'll have IP addresses. In some cases, lots of cases, it has very easily identifiable information. All of their posts, all of the data was scraped from the entire time that it was up. So, I imagine, that, there are a lot of people who were involved, who are no longer involved, who have left, who have heard that this is coming, and are just like, what do I do? How do I protect myself and my data? How do I keep my
reputation,
my name and my identity? And,
And what are you saying? How are you counseling these people? I mean,
a lot of it is just like, we can, we can talk about how to begin to like piece your life back together and talk about what's going on in your life, so that there is like, that you're living this body of evidence that you have in fact changed and feel remorse and, and understand that wasn't just like a thing you did online, like that there's actual hurt and harm that is inherent, and that human beings were hurt and harmed.
Oh my gosh.
But there's not a whole lot I can do, right? Like, I'm just kind of like, it's sort of like a microscopic version of what is happening like post January 6th, right? Like, so it's kind of like, it's that whole idea. It's like, you got to have, sometimes there are consequences that you have to face.
Let me ask you this, Shannon. So are you getting the sense that some of the people who took part in the attack on the Capitol are remorseful, understand that what they did was not okay? Have you gotten that sense at all? Have you even had any conversations with anyone who was there?
I think it's too soon to tell. It's again, like so much of my worldview is filtered through the lens of being a mom. Like I have 8 kids, like I have 7 kids and a stepson. Like so much of my worldview is filtered through that lens. And, it's like, when your kids get caught doing something that they know they weren't supposed to do. And, and you're just like, oftentimes like the first thing is just, they're like, oh, well, it was so-and-so's fault, or, like that they try to minimize their involvement. Like, that I think that is something that's part of like human nature. And then it takes time and guidance and allowing them to experience consequences of their actions and see how it's like impacted other people, and, and guiding them so that there is like amendment. It's like that I don't think we're in that stage yet. And it really remains to be seen whether or not there's actually going to be consequences outside of a handful of people. That I think the last count that I recently saw was somewhere between like 200 and 250 people who have been arrested.
That have been arrested, I know, out of the thousands who were there.
And like over the summer, during the racial justice like protests, it's like 10,000 people were arrested over the course of a few months. Like, so.
Okay, let's.
I'm just like, those are two very different numbers, and speaks to me like we're not really at the point of like holding like consequences.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm a rag.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I want to back up for a second and remind our audience that you came from a background, and folks, just again, if you have not watched the first interview that I did with Shannon, please go back and watch it, because she goes into great detail about, your background, her background, and how she ended up being in a neo-Nazi white supremacist movement. But since then, Shannon, you've been working very diligently to try to help people leave and help families understand the dynamics of a loved one who is in that mindset. So you had a really just very emotional, somewhat, I would say even provocative sort of post on YouTube on the day of, on January 6th when they were certifying the election.
It was on the inauguration. It was on the inauguration.
It was on inauguration day. Forgive me. It was on inauguration day. And you were talking directly to people who wanted to speak with their loved ones who were in QAnon and talking about how to support them. One of the things that you said is that you have to have empathy. There are some who would say, how is that even possible? Explain why, in your view, you have to come at someone who is in that frame of mind with empathy.
Well, and I mean, as per like our last conversation too, that for me, that who we're asking to have empathy, I think is a worthy discussion to have. That asking victims and targets of hurt and harmful actions and worldviews is a serious misstep, right? But if we're talking about the families and the people who have loved ones who are doing this and engaged and entrenched in these, actions and worldviews, that's pretty squarely like our responsibility. For me, as somebody who has lifelong amends to make, like that is definitely my responsibility to do that.
When you say the collective our, do you mean family members? Do you mean white people? Who's the our that you're referring to there?
I think very specifically, the family members and people who have, who are directly and intimately involved with these people. And then I also think that empathy, because of what we're talking about, and that it is, that we're talking about various white supremacist and white supremacist adjacent and, worldviews and spaces and anti-Semitic and that, yes, I mean, white people. Like that, I think that that this and which is not to say that if Black folks or non-whites, people of color, Indigenous people want to do that work for their own holistic healing, like that is that is fantastic. That is amazing. But it's just not their job,
right? It's not
right. Like it's just not their job. It is not Black people's responsibility to save white people from white supremacy. Like it just isn't. That work is very often put,
could you say that
moves
again?
Forward.
Could you just say that again? It is not Black people's responsibility. Go ahead, say it again.
It is not Black people's responsibility to save white people from white supremacy. Now, because there are so many amazing, Black activists and thinkers and people that are out there, that most of what we have to learn about our whiteness and how it manifests itself in the world in so many different ways comes from the work of Black folks and Indigenous folks and other people of color. Like that we have an immense debt to pay.
So let me ask you this, Shannon. So when you think about things from the perspective of the white community, what is it that, white people should be doing right now to help us move past the moment that we're in? Because we're in this log jam right now. And so what is it that white people should be doing?
One of the things that I think would be helpful is to gain awareness about the stories that are out there and the stories that that we read and experience on the internet, and look to what story it's telling. Right? I have so many people in the media who are reaching out to me. They want to follow and tell the story of people who are disengaging, people who, were involved in QAnon and are now like in the process of leaving, or families that are like grieving their loved ones. And, and while it can be very comforting and useful to know that if you have like a family member engaged in this, that you are not alone in that struggle. But I find overwhelmingly that that's the story that we want to hear, the stories that are told. And it keeps everything so focused on, like white redemption narratives, right? Like that it's just like, okay, like this person was bad and now they're good, or, or whatever. And then we especially love that story if they've had an interaction with, a previous person that was like a victim or a target of their ideology or whatever. Like
what is the story we should be telling instead?
I think the story that I think we need to expand beyond those stories, right? Like, and that these are individual stories, but that this is collective work that we all need to do. I've been, engaged in, in this work and looking at, trying to like help people leave these movements. I mean, I'm passionately falling on deaf ears about like prevention and building better prevention models and what that means, and framing that in terms of, not just like how do we keep people from doing bad stuff and engaging in bad things and harmful things, but also like what do we have to do so we can cultivate human beings who thrive, on the like hypothesis that thriving human beings are going to, are very unlikely to find resonance with destructive and hurtful and harmful belief systems and actions, right? So one of the things that I believe is that we really, as a culture, as a nation, will find stories like January 6th, like, mass shootings, mass attacks. We actually really need those stories, because it allows us to, and by us, like, I mean, primarily like white America, it allows us to externalize what we think of as white supremacy. So there's, there's some sort of, I don't know, you look at the stuff that happened on January 6th, you look at that and you're just like, oh, look at those bad white supremacists out there. Like we all saw the t-shirts and the gear and, the overtly Nazi, neo-Nazi paraphernalia and overtly white supremacist stuff. And we look at that and we say, wow, that's terrible. Look at that. Look at those white supremacists. That is awful. And that allows us to like externalize that on its only on white supremacy's most violent and overt expressions. And then it gives us a problem to fix. It gives us a place to be like, we got to keep people from that. But what it in effect does is excuses us from being like, okay, like number one, that's just its most overt and violent expression. And it allows us not to look like internally to be like, okay, well, what's my own relationship with white supremacy in this like systemic form, also in like just acute forms, like how do I exist in the world? How do I, even just like engage and have conversations with other people, and how do I wield my whiteness in like community, groups and, I don't know, school board, like, or whatever, like what is my relationship with that? And what am I doing to address and, come to understand like that we live in an entirely white supremacist system that we still haven't dealt with. Like our foundational documents are still have overtly racist language. Slavery is still legal. Like, I mean, it's
and many white people have such a difficult time embracing the concept that you just described, and even have problem with the term white privilege. I had someone say to me, that just really rubs me the wrong way. I worked hard. My family, came from a very difficult situation, and we worked hard, and I just really have a hard time with the term white privilege. What would your response be to that?
Well, that there's lots of different systems of power at play, right? Like that there is race and class and gender and like all of these different ways that power is structured, and the way that we try to, empower ourselves and our family in our lives. And so it is definitely possible to be a white person and to have struggled deeply and immensely in America, like absolutely. But it is incredibly, incredibly rare, like almost pretty, I won't say never, but that you're not struggling because of your race, right? Like there aren't laws coded into the system. There isn't language coded into the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution where your humanhood is up for question. Like where either you are just not counted as a person because you're considered, a savage, or that you're considered 3/5 of a person. That your humanity has never been drawn into question throughout the entirety of our formation as a nation. And that it's okay if you don't know that history. I was talking to this amazing human named Mark Charles, who actually ran for president in 2020. He has a book out called, I think it's Inconvenient Truths. And he talks about a lot of this from the indigenous lens. And so many of his ideas are just amazing that he's like, if you had a company, you wouldn't operate under bylaws that were written in the 1700s, right? Like you would adapt them, you would update the language, like you would go back and review it, and and it's like
analogy. I love that.
And that's not mine. That's his. That's I don't want to take credit for that at all.
I get it.
But it's like, so why don't we just update the language and the bylaws of of the Constitution and stuff, so that like we the people, in fact, actually means like all of the people. That there's a lot, and I'm so scattered right now. He also, so his idea too was like that history is told by the victors, right? Like that the narratives that are created historically are created by those who maintain power, right? So having grown up as a white person in America, like there is a very particular story that I have been told, that has been crafted and told, about American exceptionalism and, the mythos of how the country originated, that, a very sanitized version of genociding pretty much like an entire continent of humans who were already here. But underneath that are hundreds of years of laws and court cases and things like that have upheld this time and time and time again, and even exists like to this day. And that we have very complicated, complex histories, and even like people that we view as heroes have a very, very complicated, often really not super great legacy. People like Abraham Lincoln or Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That I mean, some of the laws and court decisions that they perpetuated are incredibly damaging to Indigenous folks and people of color. So it's okay if you don't understand. It's okay if you're only coming into this consciousness
now at this moment.
Yes, and that you don't have to feel guilty. There isn't like, nobody is saying like this is your fault or whatever. But it's like, if once you come to begin to know that something that you are doing turns out to be harmful, if you look at that and say, oh, okay, I'm going to like investigate this and feel my feelings, and I'm going to like try to understand this better because I don't want to actually like harm other people or hurt other people, even unintentionally. Now that's a very different response than just being like, okay, well, somebody's saying that I'm hurting them and I'm just going to not care. And I'm just going to be like, yeah, but what about my own pain? Like, so to me, that's, you know, like that's where we're at. It's kind of like, it's hurtful. What can I do?
For a minute. Let me just stop you there for a minute, because you talk about pain, and that is at the core and the root of so much of this. Even in your own experience of, you know, the trauma that you went through in your young life through, you know, sexual assault and just being in a dysfunctional family. And that was part of the reason that you were drawn to the white supremacist movement, because you found a sense of belonging there. There's always that need for human connection and a sense of being in a space where you can get that love and support. So when you think about all of that, and then you look at the rage and the anger and the pain that was on the faces of those who were rioting at the Capitol, what do you say to, for instance, your children, other family members who are looking at that and saying, okay, a big part of this is a result of people not dealing with their own pain and their own trauma in a productive way. They are externalizing it and blaming other people for whatever it is that they're feeling. So how do we use this as a teachable moment and then to move past it?
I think just a small, just a little question.
Yeah, nothing big. I just want you to solve all the world problems. Well, start with this first thing. What did you say to your kids that day?
Well, I'm me. So I was actually, I spent most of 2020 actually working as a bartender to feed my family. And I was actually at the bar on January 6th. So I actually,
okay.
I actually texted them and asked them, we have a board game. It's like a card game called Coup. And I asked them if they wanted to play Coup when I got home. I was like, or is it too soon? So that was kind of how my first way I addressed it with my kids. But we had been talking about this. We had been talking about this and the likelihood of this since before the election, and then definitely after the election, and leading up to January 6th. This is something that we had been talking about.
So you said you had talked to them beforehand saying that this could happen. So that it was probably going to be violence. That it was probably going to happen.
Yeah.
So you basically said to them, it's possible that there's going to be violence.
Yes, that there's possibly going to be an insurrection. There's possibly going to be a coup attempt, that there's very likely to be violence on the day that they're trying to like certify the election results. So we had already talked about it. It was multiple conversations.
Was that conversation, or were those conversations based upon your own experience and perspective, or was that based upon actual knowledge that you had been gleaning from different sources?
I think both. I think both. And I mean, and there were lots and lots of people who follow, like the far right and what's going on in terms of that. They were all just like, and I still think we're in trouble. Like, I still think the likelihood of violence is very high.
Okay. What do you think will happen next? And I know there's been talk about something happening on March 4th. What is that all about?
So, in a complicated history, there's like a movement, worldview, whatever, called like the sovereign citizens movement. And they see America as that it's now a corporation or whatever. That it's a whole complicated slew of again, like overlayering conspiracy theories. But the basic premise is that March 4th used to be the inauguration day before it was moved to January. So and it was moved to January to like minimize the lame duck period for a sitting president. And so they're basically saying that like, well, Trump is actually going to be inaugurated on March 4th because that's the real date of inauguration. So
are there events and things that are planned around that date?
There are some. I think right now, if you look at the events in Charlottesville in 2017, and in the aftermath of that, there were prosecutions, there were lawsuits, there was, increased surveillance and, law enforcement presence. And it takes 3 years for there to be another like really big mass gathering in terms of like who's who in the far right and, like far right, adjacent spaces or whatever. Mm-hmm. So I think the likelihood of any sort of mass gathering right now is very unlikely. I think there's too much surveillance.
Yeah. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things going on behind the scenes or things that could be planned on a smaller, more localized basis.
Yes. And I think that that's what we will see. I don't know. There was just, and there was just a shooting the other day at a health clinic in Minnesota. There were explosives stolen from a military base. There was a Humvee stolen from a military base. So my guess is that we will continue to see acts of violence, but more in terms of state and symbolic targets, rather than like large mass gatherings at this point, which isn't to say that can't happen. I mean, a lot of what the future holds really depends on multitudinous factors. But one of the things that we know from history is that if there is like a coup attempt and that there are no consequences, that there is a high likelihood that there will be another coup attempt in the not too distant future. And
speaking of consequences and accountability, at this moment, as we are talking, the second impeachment trial is underway. President Trump's attorneys are, at this moment, trying to defend him in this impeachment trial. If there is no conviction, what are the consequences of that as it relates to the far right movement?
I'm not sure in terms of necessarily of like the movement, but it definitely gives it oxygen. I don't know if you look at the history of Nazi Germany, that the rise to power actually begins with a failed coup attempt, in which there were like no consequences. In South America, there's several regimes where very similar things have happened. I think without consequences, it allows people to like reorganize and just learn from their mistakes to do a better job next time. To increase the likelihood, understand where they need people positioned in power, right? Like, I don't know. I often feel like as Americans, we're just like the petulant adolescents of the world, right? Like that we refuse to learn from other people's previous mistakes and from our own mistakes, right? Like, in large part, if you look even just to our own history, that Reconstruction comes after the Civil War, and there are very few consequences in terms of generals and people in power in the South. And I mean, and then not too long after, then we, get Jim Crow laws and stuff like that. That very much like American segregation.
It just morphed into a different type of oppression. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And then it becomes mainstreamed. Like it becomes mainstreamed into, that is like the people overwhelmingly who hold power, political power and political positions in the South are running and winning specifically on segregationist policies, right? So, I mean, like, that's just like our own example. Like, and this is not even that long ago, right? Like, it's not even historically, it's still pretty recent. So in my opinion, it's like, if we do not hold ourselves accountable for what just happened, that we are in incredibly high danger of another future attempt. Like, I don't know. I really struggled with the inauguration and watching the inauguration and just calls for unity. And I'm just like, who are we unifying with? Like right now, there are people who are just like, it's all fine. Like we have people in like, who are we working? Who are we saying? Who are we unifying with? And is there accountability?
So you said you struggled with the inauguration and the calls for unity. So are you saying, are you saying that you think that President Biden should not have expressed that as part of his message and his intention and desire to unify the country? What are you saying exactly? What were you struggling with?
I think if you are not also intensely concerned about accountability, that you're asking people to work with and to unify with people who were engaged and are still engaged in harmful and hurtful behavior and anti-democratic behavior, and overtly racist behavior.
I understand now what you're saying. And so those two things have to happen simultaneously. So obviously he's not going to use his inauguration speech to call for accountability and the impeachment of his predecessor. The calls for unity, it's so interesting. And I think, my struggle with that is not so much from when you say you struggled on Inauguration Day, but my struggle with that is that those calls are coming from the very people who are at the center of helping to divide the country. And now all of a sudden it's, let's be unified. let's put that behind us. We don't need to look at those pictures again about what happened. We don't need to look at that video. Let's just move on and unify. That's what gets me upset, because that's where the accountability needs to come in. And it's not just for President Trump, but it's for all of those who enabled him over this last, 5+ years.
Yeah. But the reason that they have the leverage to use that messaging is because there was a call for unity coming from Biden on Inauguration Day. So they can now be like, well, what about unity? You don't want to work with us. You're not listening to us or whatever. And I think in some ways it gets to the heart of like one of the problems we face in terms of like increased like polarized viewpoints where people are just like, I'm this or I'm this, and and we lack nuance and we lack complexity, and we lack the ability to sit in the like gray area of like, okay, some of this is good and some of this isn't good or whatever, and I think that really kind of gets to the heart of the matter, because it's...
Yep, I completely agree with you. So my question now is, what can we as individuals, as Americans, as citizens who love our country, and so many of us really do want to find a way out of this, divide that has gotten us to the point where, as you just said, it's all this or it's all that, and there's no nuance and there's no in between. Based upon your experience of having come out of the movement, the work that you have done on yourself first, and then in recent years as a consultant to try and help others come out of this movement that's fueled by hate. Okay, what is it? What are the kinds of conversations that we should be having with each other to help us move the needle on this?
I think one of the most important steps that we can take is to assume best intent from other people, right? Assume that rather than assuming malice, assume they either aren't yet capable of doing better, or don't know to do better, or don't have the skills or tools to do better, rather than like immediately being like, oh, well, they're just a bad person or whatever. It's like, and which is not, again, like that's different from like personal boundaries and stuff like that. But assume that we're all on a learning and growing curve, including ourselves. Just be like, well, okay, we're all works in progress. Some of us are devoting more time and energy to work, being a work in progress. Some of us might not even really know yet that we need to devote time and energy to being a work in progress. But, insisting for ourselves on viewing other humans through the lens of humanity, that people are complex. They often, even the people that like have done horrible and terrible things and are, showing no remorse for them, that they're still human beings. And that says a lot more about us than it does about them for how we view that, right? Which doesn't mean to say we need to be like, that's an okay behavior, but it's like, if we insist, like, that is a human who is engaged in this behavior, and that there is this whole complex story behind this immediate story for how this person has ended up here, right? And just insisting that we view the world that way, and not through the lens of like, well, those people are bad. Because one of the things that that I think would be very useful is for us to understand how we are marketed to, and do a better job identifying the like core feelings behind a lot of the things that we read or the stories that were told or the story, if you're scrolling through your social media and you're like, yeah, anything that you have a really strong reaction to, positive or negative, but especially like positively, like that's confirmation bias. We like look for it, we like it, it releases dopamine for us, and anything that you're just like, yeah, that's, to me, that's an indicator like, I need to dig a little deeper and I need to like look for more to this story.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And
but you know, Shannon, it's taken you a long time to get to this point. And when we first met, and I was interviewing you as part of a video that I was producing about countering violent extremism. And during that interview, I shared with you the first time that I had been called the Nword, and you cried. And that was an unexpected response on my part. And the fact that, you know, when you were actually living in Houston, at the time that, and it wasn't actually the first time I had been called it, but it was a time that I had been called it and I was on the air, and it was a very stressful time. And you said to me, that could have been me. And the fact that we are now having a second conversation, and the fact that we are now having a second conversation, I think should help people feel hope and understand that transformation is possible, that, you know, someone who had grown up or spent a period of her life looking at someone like me and thinking that I was the other, could years later sit down and have face-to-face conversations about this very, very difficult topic. What is this conversation, the fact that we're having it, what does this say about humanity?
To me, it's like we don't have to stay locked into like the worst of us, right? Like that we can heal, like we can cultivate a world where people thrive. We can create an environment where we can have difficult conversations. We can create, a legacy where we begin with processing through our hard, difficult, terrible, dehumanizing stories and hear those stories, and bridge to conciliation, and, you know, like, and then from there work together towards transformation. Like, what do we want to be? But like for me, that's, you know, that our conversations, like we are able to sit and hear one another and not turn inward, be defensive, say it's, you know, like, it's not my fault. You have chosen to also like decide to see more of me than just the harm that I put into the world. For me, I have chosen to hear and honor and empathize and sympathize with your pain that you have expressed. And from there, you know, continue to talk. And to me, like, that's what we have to do. And is it painful? Is it hard? Is it difficult? Does it require vulnerability? Does it require like the fact that we might be, you know, rejected or, you know, or whatever? Like, yes, all of that is true. All of that is very true. But it also does mean like that we can totally do this. But, you know, I don't know. I think we are so bad at identifying our emotions and sitting with those emotions and, you know, being like, I'm really afraid. Like the whole, like who knows? We really live in a pandemic that is still out of control. I don't know like what my financial future holds. I don't know what my children's future holds. I don't, you know, everything that was present in my life at this point last year has been like completely like transformed, and like everything is so uncertain. And like, of course we're afraid. Of course we feel disempowered. Of course we feel all of these like big dark feelings, like heavy, real feelings. Some of us feel relief because it's like, okay, well, we get to be home. And that's a confusing emotion or whatever, you know, and it's like, but if we can learn to do that in just like our individual lives, even if it's like, okay, I'm like yelling at my kids to clean up the house. Yeah. I'm like, yeah, I need the house cleaned. And it's like, okay, if I can stop and be like, why do I want that? What am I actually feeling? Okay, I'm feeling like I need a sense of control over my environment right now. And it's like, if I can just sit with that and be like, why is it so important to me that my house get clean right now? Mm-hmm. Like, then I can be like, oh, I actually am feeling a need to like have a sense of control over my environment. Okay. And then I can be like, hey guys, I'm feeling like I'm feeling really chaotic and out of control right now. I would like to, you know, like get the kitchen cleaned up. Would you be willing to help me? Right.
You know, we need to learn how to, as you say, to identify our feelings and to sit with them and not project them onto someone else and blame someone else for whatever it is that we are feeling and not dealing with. And yes. That's the bottom line.
And in addition to that, it's important because those fears and uncertainty and all of that stuff is being marketed to. Because fearful people are easily controlled. They're easy to be manipulated. It's easy to get them to vote against their own best interests. It's easy to castigate others as the real problem or whatever. And that people who are trying to like ascend to and maintain power, that it's in their best interest to like completely exploit fears and exploit those feelings that we have so much difficulty sitting with and feeling. And so for me, it's like, it's also just like looking at, after we begin the practice of just like identifying and feeling our feelings, to then look how those things are being marketed to. And that's a skill that we should absolutely teach our children. Like, how are these things that I'm feeling, how are they being used by, because we're being marketed to all the time by the stories that we're told, by, media, by social media, by, everything that it's like, we are being marketed to all the time. So looking for how we're being marketed to, I think is really important.
You're right. It is important. And that we could do a whole nother conversation just on media illiteracy and not understanding how to decipher and filter information, how to vet information, because there's so much that's out there. How do you know what to believe? So that's a whole nother conversation. But I just want to say, I think that your voice is so important right now, and it's so needed. I'm glad that you're out there in this space, using your personal experience of having come from the background that you did, your dysfunctional family situation, moving into a far right movement, and then coming out of it and using the benefit of what you have learned to help others. As we wrap up the conversation, what is the one thing that you want to leave people with that you think will help us get through this next very challenging, difficult period that we're facing?
I think one of the only, I have come to adulthood without having to ever live through the illusion that I couldn't be or act racist or like in an anti-Semitic way. And so I don't have to like grapple with the idea like this is something that is something that I'm like capable of or whatever. Where I think a lot of white America in particular has trouble identifying like, okay, like there are ways that like that my life still continues to like sort of perpetuate and uphold and benefit from the system that we live in or whatever. And I think one of the things is just to learn like self-compassion, but also like truth-telling for ourselves. Like it's okay to come to an understanding that that the system that we live in and have built around us is really harmful. That doesn't make us bad people, but it's what we do next, and to focus on that, and that's in essence like what I do, you know, in terms of mentoring people as they leave. And like right now, my inbox is so full of concerned family members, particularly like around like QAnon stuff and everything. And there's lots of people who want, you know, media reaching out, and I'm just like, there isn't a formula for leaving and getting out and transforming your life, just like there isn't going to be a formula in terms of like the overarching societal changes that need to happen. And if they don't happen, we won't ever thrive. Like the truth and conciliation and transformation work that we need to do has to happen, or we will never thrive. Like we will continue in this spiral that we're in. But that it's a process, and that it is a very long process. Like I'm 46 now. I have been out of overt violent white supremacy for over 25 years. And I still feel like I am in the infancy of learning about, you know, my whiteness and my relationship with power, and discovering things about myself and how to walk through life in a less harmful way. Like I'm in the infancy of that. I only just have a commitment to keep going, right? That this is a long process. As people are leaving these movements, that it's a very long process most of the time, and that in the beginning of that work, mostly they're not ready to look at the trauma that they have suffered, the trauma that they suffer because of the things that they've done as a perpetrator, that sitting with the shame and processing that, like that, mostly that's not even something that's on the table for several years, because that there's other healing that has to happen first. So not to lose hope, and know that, like, I don't know, to me, it's so worth it that the things in my life that I didn't have access to on this like micro level, on this like individual level, it's like when I was like immersed in white power stuff, it was like I was separated from genuine like joy, from a sense of wonder and awe, from deep and meaningful connection, and like from being able to be like authentic and vulnerable before other people, to feel deeply and truly loved for exactly the flawed human that I am. I was so separate from those, and I had no idea And it's only now that I'm like, oh my gosh, like, look at all of these things that are in my life that make it so worth living and continuing to like struggle through. And, which is not to say everything's like peachy keen. Like, things are, I have huge struggles. I have very dark periods of time. It's like, my life isn't like, there isn't, I didn't like consume like a pill and just poof, my life was better or whatever. But it's like, but the work and the long suffering of that work and is so worth it in ways that I would have never ever even begun to like be able to articulate or put into words or even know that they were things. And so like taking my individual, anecdotal experience or whatever and projecting that out onto like this macro level, it's like we lack so much imagination about what our future can be. Like this future where, we the people means all of the people, where there is genuine like equity and that we, that we don't live in a colonialized like power structure and stuff. Like we completely lack imagination for what that could even be like, the possibilities that are out there for how we can thrive. And just to hold that hope. And like, even if we can't envision it, I don't know. I have my youngest kids are, 5. My oldest is 23. My youngest is 5. And the things like that, it's just my kids and their experience of the world and the ways that they're creative with the technology that we have and the discussions they're having are so powerful. And so, it's like, for me, like, I don't know, somebody like learning how to use the right pronouns and, for my kids, it's just like, they know that. It's just not even a skill they need to learn. It's just inherent. And the way that even, that they come up with art and ways to use media and things like I never, ever would have ever imagined. And so for me, like, I have so much hope that if we just continue to do the messy, engaging work that we have before us, like that, there is an amazing, deeply worth fighting for future that we all can have.
Wow. I can't think of a better way to end our conversation. I feel so much more hope after listening to you and having this conversation. And you give me chills when I can feel your passion and your heart. And I know, you have your struggles like all of us, but the work that you're doing is just, it's God's work and it's really important. And I wish you and your family the absolute best. And I hope that 2021 turns out to be a phenomenal year for you and that the positivity that you are putting out into the universe will come back to you tenfold. I really do. So thank you, Shannon. Thank you so much. If there were one thing that I hope that we all take away from the conversation that I just had with Shannon, it's that fundamental transformation is possible. Someone who has spent a good deal of their life hating can come out on the other side and learn how to love and embrace their fellow humans. It is a process, however. That's the other thing that she left us with that I think is so important for us all to remember. It took a long time for certain people to embrace a white supremacist ideology. And in order for them to come out on the other side of that, it's going to take time. And as Shannon says, and I agree with her, that empathy is a big piece of how we need to communicate and talk with each other, whether it is trying to understand and help someone come out of a white supremacist movement, or whether it's just simply having a conversation with somebody that you have a conflict with and you don't understand their point of view. We have to find a way to listen with an open mind and an open heart and have empathy for a fellow human. I want to thank you for giving Shannon permission to speak and for having the courage to listen to her with an open mind. If you like what we're doing here on our Voices Matter podcast, please like us, subscribe to us, leave a review, and spread the word. We'll see you next time.